Lars-Henrik, thank you for joining us again. You mentioned a few times Mario Draghi's report. I think he'd read your Sorbonne speech from April. Some of it sounded like you, and he framed the debate about European competitiveness in a similarly stark way as an existential challenge facing the European model. And as you mentioned, he proposed some very concrete steps, some of them quite difficult, some of them expensive, for moving Europe away from this path of decline. How many of those do you think will be implemented while you are French president?
Look, thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here with Roller, and thank you for organizing this event. Look, I hope the maximum number of items, because I really believe that we are at risk, to be honest. And it's just a word. I think our own model was completely changed and has to be reset. And when you look at the European model, largely based, by the way, on the strengths of Germany during the past decade, we were based on exports and a big part of the key industry, car-making industry, to China. We were based on low-cost energy, Russian gas. We were based on defense umbrella from the US, without any question. And everything now is shaken. China has overcapacities and is clearly a competitive place. So it's no more a secured place for our exports. Russian war killed low-cost energy, and the killer of our competitiveness today is a big gap in terms of energy prices everywhere. This is why we have to completely change our business and have an integrated energy model, because we can deliver with nuclear and renewables, but not without being integrated. And very clearly, post Afghanistan, some people can have doubt, and the potential change in leadership in the US means that this is not a guarantee total. So I want to insist on that, because it's super important to assess fairly the fact that our former model is over. And this is not a question of adjustment. This is not the same world, 2024, 2025. And on top of that, we are making the same mistakes on top of the key elements I mentioned. We are over-regulating and under-investing. So just if in the 2 to 3 years to come, if we follow our classical agenda, we will be out of the market, I have no doubt. So I think what we have to deliver in the 2 to 3 years to come is capital market union. My view is that we have to rush on energy beyond what we already decided, which will be implemented for 2026, which will avoid the big peak and the instability of the energy market we had during the past few years. We corrected that, but we have to go much faster and further. And we need this investment shock I mentioned. And I think the simplification agenda and let's say, pause in terms of regulation, but even deregulation in some issues, it's absolutely critical.
Can you have any investment? Can you have that investment shock without issuance of joint debt?
I think the best way to deliver is not to create big trauma at the beginning, by experience.
But you persuaded the Germans before. Can't you do it again?
This is true, but I was. If I want to be fair, I was a little bit helped by a colleague called COVID-19, and it changed the reality. But what I think we have an external systemic shock. I think we have to assess that. During the pandemic, we all experienced a symmetric shock for all our economies. And this is why we made this move with Chancellor Merkel. And I think it was a unique move, and this is really, for me, a fundamental change of our EU. Now, I want us to be totally aware of the fact that we are living a symmetric shock on our economies whose scale and magnitude is underestimated. Because the reallocation factor is huge. Look at the chemical industry in Europe, completely being relocated because of IRA I mentioned. If you don't deliver the level playing field agenda, we will be super happy with REACH as a good regulation for European consumer, but for no more existing chemical industry. And it will be the same for steel. It will be the same for, the existing business we have because of energy costs and over-regulation. So we have to fix energy issue and over-regulation. And for me, single market on energy, and on top of that, diversification of our furnishers to reduce this discrepancy, and acceleration of level playing field agenda and pause in terms of regulation. It's critical. And if we don't have the level playing field agenda, we will be killed in this market. And in parallel, for clean energy and artificial intelligence, we have to invest much more rapidly and protect as well our key players. Otherwise, they will be reallocated in the US.
Lars Henrik, I mentioned the joint debt question, but actually there's a broader issue here that you listen to President Macron, you read the Draghi report, you read many speeches, frankly, from European leaders, but not from the German Chancellor, not from German leaders, assessing the threat to the growth model as fundamentally as this, in the stark language that President Macron has used. If looking on the outside, how does Europe move forward, rush forward on this agenda if there isn't that understanding, that same analysis at the top in Germany?
I'm not sure that you don't share the analysis with the Chancellor Scholz. Obviously, he's a different person. But I think the analysis that we need simplification, what you were just saying, we need more investment, we have less regulation. I think that is something which, the Chancellor also says. And I think that's a fundamental issue. I think capital market union, as I said, is an important step. But in the end, and he has been a remarkable European. I remember when you first came, you're actually a Sherpa for a while, if I may say that.
You were both Sherpas together, right?
Yeah, but he has moved on a lot since then.
I don't think you should feel bad. I think it's okay.
And of course, there's a reason why he's moved on. And so he came on stage and he said, "We want Europe," and you give your speech. And there was a debate whether Germany was responding appropriate to the young French president who was doing that. But I think he was always this good European, and I think we're very lucky to have him actually as a European. Also, if you think about the latest developments in your country, if I may say so, Mr. President, and also in our country. And I think the ultimate problem always in the end, and you alluded to that in the previous round on AI, the Justerie 2 or the European industrial policy, is that there's still no European answer to many of these things. And if, an industrial policy on deregulation, and Draghi report makes that point. And is Europe really ready to give more power? You always also talked a lot about the governance of Europe and the way we are organized with Commission and Council and very powerful national leaders. And that is a fundamental issue, which I think makes it very difficult. But I think this is something which, in the end, is going to be, again, a very important issue. So I think that is something which is... But I think that the Draghi reports on the common debt, this is where I was getting here. I think, if I may say that, and you're closer, of course, than I am, I don't think the problem is not the common debt per se, but I think is that you want to make sure that the money is spent properly and there's no moral hazard with it. We discussed this a long time, many, many times. So I think it requires also certain governance. For example, you think about the defense union. I think if you want common debt on the defense union, you also need competences at the European level, because you have to have the decision power and the debt really hand in hand. So I think the common debt is easier once you give more of the governance also to the European level. But that's really a difficult issue. So I would I would, and I think this is an ongoing process, but I think what you're saying makes sense. But I think in the end, the big disadvantage of Europe is really, I'd be interested in what you think, is that we really don't have in many of these areas this European vision, which of anybody has actually. He does, yes. But it's not easy in Europe, and even if I may say so, if Germany and France, you said on Capital Market Union in Meseberg, you have a paper, which took us, I think, 10 years or something to get a French and a German position on that. Then the question is also, is the rest of Europe going to fall in line? That's also an interesting question because they're getting more competent and more confident as well. So the leadership of Germany and France is very, very important. I think it's the only way actually to move Europe forward. I think that's also your view. But are the others then also in the future more likely to fall in line in terms of moving Europe forward? Those are...
Can we move on, just speak in, because maybe it took 10 years to have Franco-German agreement on that, but we've only got a few days to have Franco-German agreement on the tariffs on Chinese electrical vehicles, and you mentioned it in your speech. On this stage a year ago, actually, I spoke to Chancellor Scholz, who said he didn't want to see a trade war with China. Mm-hmm. He didn't like tariffs. His minister earlier said something quite similar. But there is a vote on whether those tariffs go through on Friday. So can I just ask, do you think that will pass, that the EU governments will confirm those tariffs?
I don't know before the vote. I can tell you that I do support the European Commission on that. Because what I was speaking about, electrical vehicles on the European market. And what is the reality? You have the European car makers, they go to the market, and by the way, we use our taxpayers' money to subsidize the consumer to buy these cars. And they have to compete with some car makers producing in China with an existing advantage, but it's part of the offshoring production because they produce in much lower cost condition. But on top of that, they benefit from subsidies from the Chinese government. This is a bias for your market. I think this is, the question is, which model do you choose? Do you want to be a consumer or a producer? And now this is the dilemma we have. 20 years ago, for solar panels, we decided to kill our markets. And we had the same dilemma. We did choose. We killed our industry. We had an existing industry. We killed it. And we deployed solar panels in a lot of places, Chinese ones. So we created a dependency, which could create some problem. We experienced that in COVID time. And we killed the ability to produce on the European soil. It's not a good idea when you need growth and you have to finance such a social model as the one we have. Now the question is, do we want a fair competition or not? I do want a fair competition. So the EU Commission launched precisely a series of studies, exchange with all the car makers, and just correct the level of discrepancies to re-establish the level playing field. So you have something from 9 to 10 for those who are less helped, and I think the range is between 21 and 35% tariffs for these car makers, but with evidence and figures which were exchanged with the car makers and will be exchanged with the Chinese industry. We already have retaliation, by the way. I can speak with a clear view because it's on cognac. Nothing to deal with the cars. And I can tell you that cognac was never helped by the French government. So, which means this is a pure retaliation. But this is a matter of credibility for our market. And I insist on that. If you don't preserve the level playing field, just don't hope that you want to produce and preserve your industrial footprint in Europe.
You spoke to Chancellor Scholz earlier.
I think we disagree on that.
Did you make progress? Unfortunately, you didn't even have any advisors in the room, and the reporters were unable. There's no chance of us finding out. So I promised I'd ask you.
I do respect all the positions and the sensitivity of the market. I think the question is, what will become the Chinese market for the car makers? My view is that it did change during the past few years, and it should not be underestimated. This market is not just a market open to our car makers. You can deploy through JVs. good operations, but this is much more competitive than it was a few years ago. Chinese car makers are super competitive and sometimes better than we are. And this is a market in overcapacities. And if we don't protect, but just restore the condition of level playing field, we will be the adjustment zone of the overcapacities, because the US just put a 100% tax, 100% tax undifferentiated. So let's wake up. We live in the same world. You cannot have China over-subsidizing, a lot of countries, even India and others, reacting to these subsidies, the US overreacting by 100% tariff, and the Europe saying, you are welcome. I mean, it doesn't fly. Otherwise, we will be happy consumers of non-European producers. I can tell you, we will have an issue of growth in a few years' time.
How important is it to have Europe? You spoke about the importance of Europe speaking with one voice. In order to get one voice on this, would you agree to a delay or some kind of compromise, or you think?
I want to be efficient and find compromise and respect all the positions. I think I want to advocate the EU Commission. They did a great job. It was bold to do so, honestly, because they had a lot of pressure not to do it. And in the DNA of the Commission, you know that you worked there, Lars-Hendrik, during years. It was not in the DNA of the European Commission to work on this type of issue. And I think it's, for me, this is a signal that clearly we have a much more strategic and geostrategic Commission as we wanted than before. But clearly I want to insist on that. We are not just a market of consumers. And we were used just to behave following this line. And this is not a good idea. And we will have exactly the same issue on steel industry. I believe that on steel industry we are much more aligned with the Chancellor and Germany. I'm sure that on Capital Market Union, simplification, we are very much aligned. So I want to insist on the fact that there is a very strong Franco-German alignment. Mm-hmm. Here is an issue very sensitive for some key players in your country, what I do respect. So the work has to be finalized with the European Commission, and I'm optimistic. But today, and Lars-Hendrik was right to mention it, we worked very hard with Chancellor Scholz on these issues, and I mean, he is very much aligned on Capital Market Union, simplification, ability to invest much more public and private money, and as well being much more reactive to protect our steel industry or our chemical industry. So you have a strong Franco-German alignment at that.
You talked about protectionism as an ugly word, and that it's about having a different a more realistic strategic vision as the US does, and certainly as China does. I wonder if, at the same time as having these tariffs for a level playing field, if you were to support, for example, finally moving ahead with Mercosur, would that send a message to other parts of the world that Europe is still open for business, that this is a specific thing with China, but actually Europe is still very much open to trade deals?
I'm in favor of any deal which will be fair.
Does it look fair right now?
Why? Because exactly the same reason, level playing field. You cannot impose a bunch of regulation to your industries and your farmers that they are digesting, by the way, because it's not yet completed, and at the same time open to economies totally disaligned with this regulation. How do you want to explain to a farmer that he will not be allowed to use this pesticide, this chemical ingredient and so on, and at the same time, on his sector, you say, you are more than welcome. You can come with your food without respecting the same rule. Honestly, I never advocate a regulation that I don't understand myself. And I think this is a good rule. And don't be naive. You speak about Mercosur. Brazil just imposed tariffs for EVs as well, and in the car system. They want to exclude public procurement from the deal. They protect themselves. They protect their economies. And my point is just, I think a lot of people in Europe underestimated what happened during the past 2 to 3 years. But we had 2 huge shocks which could completely change our approach. IRA and war in Ukraine. The end of our energetical model and the end of the WTO order. I love Ngozi, I'm a strong advocate of WTO, understand me. But just for the first time in our recent history, the US decided not to be compliant with WTO for clean tech. But this is too huge change. If we stay and stick to the same policy, we have no chance. And just look at the reallocation of so many industries, so many parts of our industries.
Just to follow up briefly on Mercosur, because after you saw him, I think Chancellor Scholz gave a speech today where he was proposing a sort of Mercosur light, the EU-specific bit of Mercosur, which doesn't involve some of the investment guarantees and things which involve government needing to all agree. So I just wondered, is that something that you would support, or would you be resigned to that happening without you?
I'm not sure to perfectly understand.
It is the bit of the Mercosur deal that has been negotiated that only involves, I think Lars Henrik will be an expert, you can explain.
No, I think he understands. He understands.
Well, I can only continue to explain.
He's strategically not understanding. Yeah.
I can be very clear.
I'm afraid to understand.
Well, the truth is, it could happen without you. That's true.
No, but I'm in favor.
No, it cannot. There's a, sorry.
This is a way.
All these trade deals have an EU part, EU only part, and then they have something, usually investment, which is national. That has to be approved by all national governments. Yes. And if you split this and just do the EU part, it only has to be ratified by the European Council. But of course, France is in the European Council, and without France, it's not going to be ratified. So if he doesn't agree, it won't happen.
Why is your Chancellor suggesting today that you just move ahead with the
because
EU, knowing that President Macron feels this way?
Well, he still has to work with France, obviously, even if it's EU only, but he will avoid going through all the national parliaments.
But
But you know that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I'm in favor. We negotiated and even ratified a lot of trade deals during the past few years. I mean, CETA with Canada, with Chile, New Zealand, and some others. And these ones are good examples of those where we integrated the climate change issue. Because Paris Agreement, if you implement it, and this is what we decided to do, and I think we're right, is sustainable if you use the fact that you have, we don't use our capacity to put pressure on our partners, given the fact that we are a market of more than 400 million consumers. But if you decide to push your producers to make a move to be compliant with Paris Agreement, which I do support, we have to do 2 things at the same time, not just constraints with milestones and new regulation. You have to invest to help them, companies or households, and to make the change acceptable and to preserve precisely part of their competitiveness. And at the same time, you have to use that to make it a strategic instrument of your industrial policy. Otherwise, you have always to choose between climate sovereignty and industry. You can reconcile them if you are ready to use it as a bargaining power. Don't you think that countries are interested to have better access to the European market? For sure. It's an instrument to create incentives for them to be compliant and have the same level of regulation than we have on these key issues. Otherwise, I can tell you, in the years to come, you will have a majority to stop with the climate change agenda, and people will dismantle the carbon neutrality agenda. For sure. Because it is not compatible. And I'm sorry to say that, but in Mercosur, it seems you have Argentina. When I hear the president, I have good relation with President Milei. But I don't hear somebody who is totally convinced by the climate agenda and wants to deliver. Matter of fact. And 2 years ago in Brazil, we had a skeptical guy on climate change. This is matter of fact. So I'm totally in favor of trade. I think we live in an open world. It provided a lot of growth during decades in our economy. I think it's part of the change of our own DNA just wake up. Both US and China, they do protect their market. They do subsidize their economy. They do invest much more than we do, both public and private innovation. So we have to adapt ourselves.
One of the big features of your presidency in the first few years, President Macron, was that strength at home gave you strength in Europe. You made decisive reforms, the employment, many other things. You got the fiscal house in order, and that gave you the power to push things through. I think many people here will be looking at what has happened in the last few months in France, the fragility of the new government under Monsieur Barnier, and wondering whether you still have that capacity to push through change. Do you worry that it was a mistake to call that election?
No, I don't think so. Why? Because it never happened without a cohabitation in France to be re-elected. So I'm very lucid about my situation. And we had a relative majority without any partners. So I called for snap elections for this reason after a little bit more than 2 years, where we delivered. I mean, during the past 2 years, we delivered a reform of indemnification of unemployed people, a pension scheme reform, an immigration reform. I mean, when I look around in Europe, I don't see a lot of countries deploying such a reform agenda. So we were under pressure, and I was very clear on the fact that when you have the far right more than 35%, you cannot follow up during 3 years to come, because I had 3 years to come, without making a move. But I think you should not see that as a source of instability. The reaction of the French people was the opposite. Because if they had confirmed the 35% for the far right, and what a lot of people thought, I would have a far-rightist prime minister today. It's not the case. So what we had for the first time in our history, which is much more the custom in your country and in a lot of European countries, is a fragmented parliament. Fine. This is less our culture to have cooperation between the parties. This is my problem. So I'm trying to create this dialectic work between the parties to work together. It's not a natural move, but I'm reasonably optimistic about the fact that reasonable social democrats, centrists, and reasonable rightists can work together for the years to come to deliver a strong agenda. And what we have to do is first to preserve and digest all the reforms we delivered during the past 7 years. And we have to deliver more for our young people. We have to complete what we did on apprenticeship to have a better and faster access to the market. It's one of the key points for the French system to have more growth. We have to follow up what we did on the unemployment system. We have to work on the access to our labor market for senior workers. And we have a lot of sectorial reform to be launched. We have, in France, this is our chance, the ability, even with a relative majority, to deliver these reforms at the parliament. But I think we can create a dynamic, and I do trust Mr. Barnier's government to be in this situation to deliver useful reform for the countries, because the agenda is quite clear. We have to modernize the country to be part of this agenda. We have to deliver at the European scale, and at the same time, we have to make more effort on social cohesion and stability of the country. This is normal in the lifetime of the country after 7 years. So I'm totally lucid about that and optimistic. But I want to focus on the fact that today, the key points of the reform agenda for me is at the European scale. I think we put in place a lot of reforms that now we have to deliver, and we have to deliver in concrete terms. We have less laws to be passed. And for instance, the pension scheme is for the years to come, and it's already voted. But the key elements are to be decided at the European scale. And I think if we want to improve our growth, both in Germany and France, for me, the top of my priority are at the European scale. So this is a sort of reverse agenda, if you compare with 2017, 2020, is that today we have to focus much more on how to simplify at the European scale, how to accelerate on the energy market, how to accelerate our financial services at the European scale. So I will dedicate much more energy at this scale because this is where we can unlock a lot of growth and potential.
But Lance Henrik, when you have a country coming to these discussions that has nearly a 6% of GDP budget deficit, as France now has, 110% debt, is having to have an extended period to get back within the convergence criteria, that is not a strong negotiating position.
You mean that country has
that country being France?
I don't think that negotiation position of France depends on the budget deficit. I think there's more to that than just that one. And I think that the European rules, I think, on the deficit criterion, which have been adjusted, actually are, as the minister was saying yesterday, very much in line actually with the German debt rule. So there's not that much difference here. And I think it should be applied. And I think, you know, I think generally there's a question of debt in the world. I mean, even you look at the US economy, they're very much, you know, over-debted. And if you look at both sides of the aisle, all of it is more spend, lower taxes, more subsidies in some cases, tariffs, which are also not going to necessarily increase growth. So I think the problem of debt in the world, I think, is an issue. And I think Europe needs to be careful of you know, having prudent fiscal rules and stimulus, and I think that's important. But I think I agree with President Macron that it is much more of a European issue. I think the future of Europe than it is a domestic French one, as he has done a lot of the reforms when he became president. I think labor market reforms, many of the things you have done. I don't, you know, and I think the regulatory issues are more important than the debt issues.
I mean,
just to highlight the point and make it clear, why are we in this situation? We had an issue during the low growth this year, so we have less return on our budget in terms of taxes. This is why we have this discrepancy with the forecast, and we had a difference in terms of forecast with some public expenditure at the local level. But more than that, to understand the French metrics, we started to diverge in the 80s because we built progressively a much more generous social model. The main factor of adjustment, if you take our balance sheet, I would say, is clearly pension reforms and healthcare system. This is a big bunch of where we have discrepancies, and especially as well because in terms of public expenditure, we have a social model where it's 100% through the budget of all the public administrations. This is why it was a necessity to pass this pension reform. And I mean, the figures and the negotiation we'll see, but probably in the next mandate, my successor will have to pass another one if they want to adjust. But the main focus, and I put my energy on one point, how to create more activity. Because why did we accumulate so many deficits and debt in the French model? This is because we never fixed the mass unemployment. And during the past 7 years, because of our tax reforms, because our labor laws reforms, because our attractiveness agenda, we've been the #1 country in terms of attractiveness during the past 5 years. We created more than 2 million jobs when we decreased, even with COVID, even with Ukraine, by more than 2 points, our unemployment rate. Mm-hmm. So we are reconverging, and for me this is the main topic, because if we had the same level of activity as Germany, we will not have public deficit. And it's much smarter to work on that than being obsessed by a short-term adjustment, which is a killer for growth. The top priority of the French economy should be how to be sure that you improve the activity rate of young people, because we have, I think, 2 to 3 points less than Germany. Your system is more efficient. When I was elected, we had 250,000 apprentices per year. We have 900,000. We are converging with the German model. We still have some work to be done at the university to better allocate the offer of training, but this is a priority. Second, reducing unemployment rate again, because we are not yet at the German level, so we have to continue the reforms, and improve the rate of access and of activity of senior workers, because we have 2 to 3 points less than Germany as well. And part of the explanation of this point is the fact that we have not the same retirement age. So the key drivers are these ones. Let's be clear. So yes, you need political courage, and you have to be fair with your people, but the solution is not to have a short-term adjustment by cutting some social expenditure because it's super hard without any agenda, or overtaxing because we don't have a lot of room to maneuver in terms of taxation, given the fact that we are number 1 or 2. It depends with Denmark in Europe. Here's the agenda.
I mean, the cuts that are being proposed, we heard them a little bit today, that just for next year, to make Monsieur Barnier's numbers add up, we have a squeezing of the deficit by 60 billion euros
exactly
next year, some of which would be taxes on wealthy individuals and big businesses. Are any higher taxes that you would support?
They will discuss that. I think having an exceptional taxation on corporate is something which is well understood by large companies, if this is for 1 year, given the level of effort which should be made. But it should be limited, and we don't have to forget, I mean, we have not to forget the reality of our economy, the reality of our competitiveness and our position. Just take an OECD comparison. We are number 1 or 2 in terms of taxation. We are not in the best tier in terms of level of activity and how working participation or hours to be worked per year. So this is what we have to improve, let's be clear.
But as you say, the most important things that you can do for the long term is the reforms like the pension reform. That is another reason why people worry. They look at the cost of the uncertainty of the last few months, and you say that the far-right threat has been contained with this new arrangement, but Marine Le Pen wants to reverse that pension reform, and tomorrow she could call a confidence vote and probably bring down the government over that. So do you think that there will be opposition, will be an effort to overturn the pension reform?
I think when you look at the figures and you are sincere with people, all the reasonable parties will look at the fact that this pension reform and these key metrics has to be preserved. And we have a structure with all our unions, and this structure now is very clear and issued figures that it was a necessity to do so. And after a dissolution, you cannot change the parliament during at least 1 year time. But what I want to tell you is that first, I ask the reality and the pricing of uncertainty by calling for the snap elections. If I did not ask for this election, I could be in front of you and you would tell me, okay, you cannot go you cannot go for election in 2.5 years. Look at the scores; they are here, and they were in a situation to call for a confidence vote and force me for a dissolution, and I would have no answer. Now, we were bold collectively. I took my responsibility. I asked the French people, "Do you want them to govern?" They answered very clearly, "No." 11 million of my people did vote for them. So it means that there is anger, fears, and clearly some top priorities that we have to face on security, on social justice on the ground, the situation of poor neighborhood and so on, rural areas and so on. So this is the agenda we will have to fix and that the government has in front of him. But they didn't give the floor to them. And look at the situation everywhere in Europe. Look at what happened in Austria. Look at what happened in Netherlands. Look at what happened in Italy. Look at what's happening in a lot of Länder in your country. So this is why I'm a strong advocate of an EU growth agenda, because this is the only way to give a return to our middle classes. Or otherwise, this is a killer for them. And this is the only way to reconcile economy and the reality of politics. But don't you think that having farmers to which you ask for reforms and efforts, and at the same time you explain, I will welcome the soya bean coming from Mercosur, is the best way to kill the far right? I can tell you for my country, not at all. And at the end of the day, do you think what is the priority today for all of us? Delivering growth and political stability, meaning fixing this anxiety of our societies and convincing reasonable people in our middle classes not to go to the extremes. But let's be clear, didn't we deliver collectively good policies for our middle classes? During decades, we delivered good policies to have the maximum of exports, the maximum of profits, but they have the feeling, sometimes for good reasons, they were the adjustment factor of our economy. This is why preserving level playing field is not just sacrificing a lot of pieces of our economy where these middle classes work. I try to be consistent.
You've been very clear. I want to get on to a question from some of the young people here, but just to very quickly follow on from that, because you have defended very clearly why you took that decision to call the election in the summer. And at the time you said it was for clarity. And I guess some people would say you didn't get the clarity, but would you make the same decision again?
Yes, because
But in the next 2 years?
No. My view is that we have to preserve now till the end of my mandate. But it's important because this is a new phase of the political modernization of France as well. I was elected in 2017 in this commitment precisely to go beyond the party system. And I gathered with me people coming from the left, the right, and the center on a common project. And now the question is how to work collectively with not just my party, but other parties. This is a new way to move forward at the parliament. But this is a very positive one for me. And this is the only one to provide stability and not to be precisely super sensitive to the extremes. At the same time, we need bold reforms. And the agenda has to be bold. And the Prime Minister was right to push some key items of this agenda. And I know that a lot of ministers will advocate for very important reforms from economic, social, and home affairs point of view. But for me, we are just building something. But look at the situation. Nothing was sacrificed. All the reforms are preserved. And this new government has to work with the parliament and progressively will build consensus. So I'm not naive, I'm reasonably optimistic. But I think at the same time, we have to accelerate to deliver a positive EU agenda.
Lars Henrik, the President has spoken very clearly about how he saw the challenge presented by the fact that you had a third of the population potentially, or voters, voting for the far right. Do you think, I mean, that is obviously an issue here. Do you think it's realistic for the centre to continue to lock out the extremes in European politics?
I think this is a big issue right now also in this country, in Germany. And if you look at some of the elections we recently had in the Länder, it's a challenge. But I do think, you know, I'm not a politician, but I do think not having them part of the government to sort of disenchant them or you know, show how they cannot do it, I think that's the wrong strategy. I think you should not have them being part of the government. I think the government has to deliver. And as you're saying, I think showing to the people that, you know, the growth and the economy and, you know, inflation and healthcare and all these kinds of issues are solved, I think that's the way to get the people to vote for you. Because I don't think in Germany, when it's 30 or more % of the people vote for parties which are very extreme, I don't think these people are very extreme. I think you need to, you know, deliver to them an important agenda and results, and then they will vote for the right thing. So I don't think the strategy, but you're much more of a politician here, to include them and then to show that they can't govern. I don't think that's the right strategy. It's also very risky. I think you need to do a good job as a politician and offer and show to the people that it's a good thing. So I think that's, but I think that's what you were saying as well.
I wanted to get to one of the...
And I should actually say, if I may say so, I was going to say that in my closing statement, that we had a survey by Egon Zehnder, surveying business people around the world, what is the biggest challenge for you right now? And the #1 challenge was nationalism and populism. So this is clearly also a business concern. So it's not good for the economy, actually, to have these kinds of results. So I think this is actually very important one.
So one of the ESMT students, the global students, Emma Yagmurova from Kazakhstan, has a question.
Bonjour à tous. Bonjour, Monsieur Macron, Monsieur Rollet, Madame Flander. Yes, as mentioned, my name is Emma. I'm a student here at ESMT, and I'm honored to be part of the Young Voices program. And our question is, with a little lead in, may you argue that deeper integration within the European Union will strengthen the EU ability to act on the global stage? But at the same time, others fear that it undermines national sovereignty. In this regard, how do you envision balancing further integration within EU and addressing concerns about about national sovereignty?
Thank you very much. By the way, I love your country. Look, I think there is a way to move forward, and this dilemma is very well known, and I think is right. But I think we have to deepen the single market, and we have as well to increase subsidiarity. And this is a way to address this dilemma. When I say we have to deepen single market, energy, for instance, telecom operators, and financial services, if you clearly deepen the single market, because on these three sectors you don't have an actual single market. It was out of the initial perspective. If you build a single market, at the same time, if you alleviate as well the burdens and the over-regulation on healthcare and some other industry, there is almost no impact on normal people, because you just force people to adopt the same regulation. It's a lot of noise, work, an hour-full session for a lot of technicians and the industry everywhere in Europe. But there is no impact on the normal life. What makes people crazy with Europe and integration is when just you bother households on their normal life. When you, which is true, but this is a well-known anecdote, but when you force an olive oil producer to be compliant with such a regulation, and when you force to stop this just geographical indication in this part of Italy or France to be compliant with this rule, when you force the hunter in one place not to do it there, but you allow the other one. I mean, this feeling, which is the resentment of some part of our population, to be blocked, disrespected in their way of life by leaders and by Europe, is due to the fact that there is a sort of unadapted approach. We go too much in the nitty-gritty. So for me, we have to stop over-regulating all the details of this way of life and focus on the big issues we have. We have much bigger issues than all this regulation. We did it for good reasons, but now we have to stop and digest. It went too far from a lot of these people. And I can tell you, because I do agree with what you said on the reasons of the far-right vote and nationalism, as you mentioned. Sometimes it's about very tiny things. Just they are fed up with this over-regulation and because they are hurt in their day-to-day life. But it's totally compliant with deepening single market in the critical areas because there is no impact on them. So my point is, let's focus on the big issues. Let's deepen single market on energy, telco, financial services. Let's create an actual single market on AI and hydrogen. It's a super agenda for the years to come. It's already an immense agenda. And let's stop regulating on the nitty-gritty and on the daily life for households. And we will calm down the resentment and the feeling nurturing nationalism, and we will deliver concrete results.
Mr. President, I want to take you right back with the final question. We've run out of time, but from where we started, which was the sense of urgency you had in your remarks, that you felt everybody in Europe should feel about the challenges facing the European growth model. And as you know, often in Europe, it's a moment of crisis. It's when politicians are looking over the ledge that they actually have done things, whether it's the global financial crisis or, as you mentioned, COVID, the invasion of Ukraine. All of those things have forced change. As an economist, I would think that the fact that the EU could be 40% smaller than the US in 20 years' time if it carries on like this is a bit of a crisis, but it's a slow-moving one. Will it take an outside force to force this kind of change? And I wonder, in that context, would the return of Donald Trump as president help you get some of this done?
Look, I think it could have consequences of the defense and security part of the agenda, for sure.
Good consequences.
Consequences. But I think we should be, honestly, I don't want to speculate on the US elections. My point, more than that, is that US is a very strong partner. This is a very important ally. But whoever will be elected, and whatever the administration is, I think we have to be lucid on our situation. Europe is no more the top priority of the US. The US top priority is US, which is normal and fair. The second top priority is China. And for the rest, it depends on the moment. They are super loyal and reliable partner on Ukraine. Will it last? I don't know. But let's be clear, at the same time, in Afghanistan, we didn't have the call before. And in the AUKUS deal in Australia, I didn't have the call before. But it's not a reproach. I try to be lucid. The EU is not the priority of the US. And this is why part of the wake-up call period of time we are living, and part of what we have to completely reshape, is our defense and security strategy. We are part of NATO, no discussion. We are a strong ally of the US, no discussion. But we have to de-risk our model from the US agenda. This is why we have to invest much more for ourselves. We have to create much more European solutions. We have to preserve much more our financing for European solutions. This is a top priority. But what you said is very important. And this is why I try to be vocal. And we moved under the pressure of crisis when they were perceived by our fellow citizens. The financial crisis and the COVID crisis. You are all here, business leaders, political leaders, intellectual leaders. Our responsibility, your responsibility, our collective responsibility is to explain our fellow citizens that this is a symmetric shock for Europe. They don't see now the results and the consequences. But our responsibility is to preempt the situation and to act now. Otherwise, it will be a rescue plan in 5 to 10 years' time. It will be awkward. And we know the situation. The figures are clear, the trends are very clear. So our responsibility as leaders is precisely to say, okay, we feel the pressure. And for me, Europe can make smart move when we have symmetric shock. During the financial crisis, don't overestimate, we did react, but we didn't take automatically all the right decisions because it was an asymmetric shock. And we fixed this crisis much more slowly than the US because we were precisely divided between North and South. It was a weakness. It was before banking union and such a level of integration. But it was an asymmetric shock, meaning we didn't have the same interest. Today we can have in the nitty-gritty some different interests. You are much more invested in car-making business, fine, which creates this kind of discrepancy. But in reality, we are already aligned because it's already too late, if I'm fair. It's already too late. So we should be aligned and just look at the situation. Whatever our differences in the energy system could be or industrial system, this is a symmetric shock for the European societies and economies. So we have to precisely deliver this in-depth reform on our governance, on security and defense, and the growth model, if just we want to deliver for our people. And this is the best way, by the way, to help all the countries precisely to limit and get rid of the extremes, because they are just held by the resentment of people and the lack of collective efficiency.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've had your marching orders from Mr. President, and I think we've run out of time. So thank you very much, Mr. President. And Lars Henrik, I think you're going to